chapter 2 of Falling Upward is probably the shortest chapter, and it deals with the stages of a hero. And Rohr talks about how the stages of a kind of classic hero, that journey is very similar to the journey that we all go through. I thought it's a very interesting chapter, and so let's go through it together and talk about it. Richard Rohr begins, he says, "If you look at the world's mythologies in any of the modern collections, you will invariably see what Joseph Campbell calls the monomyth of the hero, repeated in various forms for both men and women, but with different symbols. The stages of the hero's journey are a skeleton of what this book wants to say. In some ways, we are merely going to unpack this classic journey and draw out the many implications that are even clearer today, both psychologically and spiritually. We are beneficiaries of spiritual and informational globalization like no one has ever been before. The pattern of the heroic journey is rather consistent and really matches my own research on initiation. Those embarking on this journey invariably go through the following stages in one form or another, period." Now, what's really cool about going through this is that my daughter, she just graduated from 8th grade, and I was telling her yesterday on our walk how when I was in 8th grade, I remember doing an assignment on kind of the stages of a hero, and I had a really cool English teacher, Mr. Foster, and he had us watch Star Wars. And so we followed Luke Skywalker on his hero's journey. And it was such a great, it was a great way to look at like what a hero goes through. And we're really analyzing basically the various stages that Luke Skywalker goes through. Anyways, Rohr in this section is going to kind of break up these various stages, but instead of using Luke Skywalker, it's going to be Odysseus from the book, The Odyssey. So let's go through that and see why this journey, why this skeleton, and why kind of viewing life through this lens is important. Okay, so Richard starts off, he says, number 1, kind of first stage. They live in a world that they presently take as a given and sufficient. They are often a prince or princess, and if not, sometimes even of divine origin, which of course they always know nothing about. This amnesia is a giveaway for the core religious problem, as discovering our divine DNA is always the task. Remember, Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, but does not reign there until after the second journey, period. Okay, the part that I underlined right away was where he says, in parentheses, this amnesia is a giveaway for the core religious problem, as discovering our divine DNA is always the task. Like, I love that statement. That idea that we are all in union with God, that we are all loved of God, and that's something we figure out along the way. And once we figure that out, once we realized that we are loved, that we are included in Him, like it's such a beautiful moment, that realization. And Richard is saying, in the very beginning, we're kind of brought into this world not even realizing who we are in God. And even the Bible talks about how we are kings and queens. I guess in a sense, all of us are a divine origin. We are all created by God. Anyways, so I was thinking about this in the case of other heroes that we kind of encounter in pop culture. Like, one of my favorite movies is Jason Bourne. And again, classic example. Talk about amnesia, right? It starts off where he doesn't know anything about himself, right? He has that really terrible case of amnesia. He almost died. He has no idea of his origin, doesn't know anything about his skill set, right? that is a classic way to begin the hero journey. And that's exactly kind of where we all are in the very beginning. We have no idea who we are, what our calling is. We're just living in world and have no idea of our origin. And that's where that's kind of the first stage, kind of that unknown. In so many movies, right, that we watch, Luke Skywalker has no idea about his origin, doesn't know who his mother and father are, and that makes a huge impact later on. But yeah, I was thinking about it. Like, so many movies where we're introduced to a character, and sometimes the character knows their background, but we don't as viewers. But many times there are situations like that, especially in these great hero stories. Not that is always the case, but there is going to be a moment of self-discovery for that hero. Okay, number 2. Richard says they have the call or the courage to leave home for an adventure of some type, not really to solve any problem, but just to go out and beyond their present comfort zone. For example, the young Siddhartha leaves the walls of the palace. St. Francis goes on pilgrimage to the Muslim world. Queen Esther and Joan of Arc enter the world of battle to protect their peoples. Odysseus sets out for the Trojan War. And I think that's really where the journey for a lot of these books, these movies kind of begin, is we're kind of introduced to the character, and then we see them go out to do some task. And the more kind of complex and dangerous the task is, sometimes the more exciting it is. I think of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. You think of all these stories where there's just some task that needs to get done, some courage, leaving home, whatever that means to that character, basically doing something above and beyond what they thought they were capable of, leaving their present comfort zone. I was chatting with a friend this week about he's going to be going off to college, and this is the first time for most of us when you leave home to go someplace else, to live someplace else. And he has 2 choices right now. He has a university that's close to home, hour away, where he'd be able to come home and, enjoy weekends with his family. And there's another option of going much farther away where it's not practical at all for him to come home. And we were kind of talking about kind of the growth that happens when you move farther away. Like, just tremendous growth happens when you decide to leave that comfortable setting. Now, I didn't follow that advice. When I went to school, I went close to home, and I liked being close to home, my family and friends. So I didn't take that challenge. But I was telling him that, you know what, I might have grown even more had I went off to college and went to a different area. Who knows? I don't know. But I like the idea of like coming out of your comfort zone. Whenever we come out of our comfort zone, whatever it is, whether you take a new job, go to a new school, try some new hobby, there is kind of some fear there, some excitement there, and tons of growth, right? Visiting a new church, like whatever it is, where you're having to meet new people, like you're putting yourself out there, and it does take courage to do those things. And I have found that whenever we're challenged to do something, or whenever we get an opportunity that's going to push us past our comfort zone, that's where so much growth happens, right? So I like that. So that's kind of stage 2. So stage 1 is really this moment of amnesia. You don't know really who you are. This is where we all kind of start, all of us. And then stage 2 is where we begin to be pushed out of our comfort zone. And this happens all throughout our life. This isn't a one-time thing. There could definitely be these significant moments where we can point to and say, yeah, that was a moment that pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I had tremendous growth during that period. But certainly, we get pushed out of our comfort zone all the time, and that's part of the journey. So that's part 2, is what Richard calls the courage to leave home, or the courage to go on some sort of adventure, the courage to break out of our comfort zone. That's 2. Okay, now number 3. Richard says, on this journey or adventure, they in fact find their real problem. They are almost always wounded in some way and encounter a major dilemma, and the whole story largely pivots around the resolution of the trials that result. There is always a wounding, and the great epiphany is that the wound becomes the secret key, even sacred, a wound that changes them dramatically, which, by the way, is the precise meaning of the wounds of Jesus! Exclamation point. This one is a little bit hard because the wounding is different for all of us, and the type of wound, the type of pain that we'll endure in life. And again, these things can come in waves. There can be various woundings, various trials and painful moments in our life. Death of a family member, sickness, poverty, seeing other people suffer. These are things that happen to all of us. And those are some of the most difficult times in our lives. And I was just chatting with a friend about one of those episodes that I went through, and I described to him as it being one of the darkest times for me spiritually. And there's that phrase called the dark night of the soul. And that is totally, when I first heard that phrase, someone mentioned to me, oh, you went through a dark night of the soul. And I was like, what was that phrase? They said, oh, you never heard that phrase before? And I was like, no, I never heard that phrase. The dark night of the soul. I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's it. It's a good way to kind of explain those periods where you feel alone, you feel separated from everyone around you. No one understands what you're going through. It's a period of where you've been wounded, or you are being wounded. It's a severe, painful time. That period can be years for some of us. We don't know how long it's going to last. And that wound, that stays with us. Even though we will eventually get through that period, we're going to come out on the other side at some point. But we'll always remember that painful moment. It's right there. And if I start to think about it, I can go there. I can understand what that pain felt like again and again and again. That wounding happens to all of us. And it was interesting that when you think about this in the case of the hero, some classic stories, I was just thinking about how I just watched, of all movies, I just watched the last Rambo movie. I think it's called Last Blood, which is just a violent, just a totally violent movie. And it's kind of one of those revenge stories. And I tend to definitely like revenge stories. You kind of want justice, right? You want justice to be served, to destroy the bad guys. I love those kind of stories. Well, talk about wounding. Like the Rambo character has had a series of woundings that have happened to him, metaphorically, physically. Anyways, in that story, the very beginning of the story is you have Rambo, and I hadn't seen the early movies, so I didn't really quite know his character too well, but kind of the same kind of setup is you don't really know the full details, right, of all his all of his skills and things he's gone through. But anyways, the wounding was when the kind of the daughter that he kind of raised is killed by some bad people. And that's kind of the setup. And in the case of the Rambo movie, that was the wounding in The Last Blood, was he now needs to avenge. He's now out for blood, literally, to to bring justice to these bad criminals. And yeah, and so many movies are built on like revenge stories or some sort of wounding that happens. And it takes many shapes. And for us, like I was describing, like it can come in many different varieties. And sometimes it feels like in life that we are wounded and then recovering, and then we get wounded again, and then we're recovering. And sometimes life is like that. And sometimes we get these breaks of where we can just kind of settle in, relax, heal. And in that process of healing, we can help others. And those can be beautiful moments where we identify other people in our lives who are in the midst of a wounding, and we can come alongside them to help them. But we all know that just a matter of time, unfortunately, before something else happens. It's just part of life. So anyways, that's the third kind of stage that Richard calls out, is kind of that difficult moment, those difficult moments that come up that begin to shape us like nothing else. You can call them trials, call them tribulations, call them traumatic moments, whatever the wording is for you. Like that's kind of the part of every hero's journey, is in the midst of your journey, in the midst of your adventure, in the midst of you coming out of your comfort zone or whatever, you encounter these hard moments. Okay, so now Richard goes into number 4. He says the first task, which the hero or heroine thinks is the only task, is only the vehicle and warm-up act to get him or her to the real task. He or she falls through what is merely his or her life situation to discover his or her real life, which is always a much deeper river, hidden beneath the appearances. Most people confuse their life situation with their actual life, which is an underlying flow beneath the everyday events. This deeper discovery is largely what religious people mean by finding their soul. And I think here is kind of how when we talk about like finding your calling, finding your true self, like those kind of metaphors, like what you're meant to do, who you're meant to be. And you hear people talk about like, I finally found out what I need to be doing. I finally found out my calling. I know who I am now. Like those metaphors, it's hard to, I guess when we talk about this kind of spiritual language, I think the only way we could talk about it is like through metaphor. But that idea of like what we're meant to be doing, that's kind of the what Richard calls the deeper discovery, that deeper river. And that's part of that journey. At some point, you kind of uncover what it is you're meant to do. And I guess in many times that comes after the wounding. I wish it didn't. And maybe there's cases where people come to this point without a significant wounding, a significant painful moment. I hope so. But I think in the classic hero tale, the Luke Skywalkers, the Odysseus, the Jason Bournes, like it's through that traumatic moment that they finally realize that, or through that wounding, that they realize what their real task is, what they're really called to do. I wish it wasn't the case. But then, at least from the storytelling aspect, like, it makes for a great story on screen. It makes for a great story to read, right? But you kind of wish that the hero's journey, like in real life, you kind of wish, man, do they really need that wounding? Can't they just go from point one where they don't know who they are, they discover who they are, and they discover their true calling? But that's not the way it works. A good story has those woundings, and unfortunately for us, it's those painful moments where growth happens if we want it to happen. Because I've gone through painful moments and felt like I didn't learn anything other than I am now bitter. I am now angry. And so I don't want to even pretend that this sequence that we're reading through, the 1, 2, 3, 4, that it always works like this for us, because I've gone through painful moments where my natural reaction was just to be angry and bitter, and I thought life was just so unfair and cruel. And yeah, I would not, if you were to ask me in those moments, or even a year out, what did you learn from that experience? What did life teach you? I would be like, that life is painful, that life sucks, and I had a really bad attitude about it. And so I don't want to pretend at all like this sequence of steps that, oh, you come out on the other side and you kind of learn what life taught you, and oh wow, what a beautiful thing that, you know, I come out on the other side and I'm like a happier person, more understanding person. Like, yes, that's beautiful when that happens that way. But that's not always the way it happens. And sometimes it can take you years or maybe never to get to that moment where you can come out on the other side feeling kind of a rebirth and an understanding of how to help others. That doesn't always happen for all of us. And sometimes it can take years where we're sitting down in that wounding period and just upset. And that's totally human, right? I totally get that. So as we go through these steps, I don't want you to think that I'm that it's like Richard is kind of organizing it to kind of help us see these various stages. That's all he's doing. How long we spend in these different stages, and if we even get to certain stages, is going to be up to us and life, and it's going to really vary. But I think the point here is Richard's kind of pointing out, kind of in the hero story, the classic hero story, here's kind of things that happen along the way. Okay, so 4, the whole idea behind 4, the fourth kind of step is right, really like finding your true calling, finding your true self, what you're meant to do. And then number 5, Richard says the hero or the heroine then returns to where he or she started and knows the place for the first time, as T.S. Eliot puts it, but now with a gift or boon for his people or her village. As the last step of Alcoholics Anonymous says, a person must pass the lessons learned on to others, or there has been no real gift at all. The hero's journey is always an experience of an excess of life, a surplus of energy, with plenty left over for others. The hero has found eros, or life energy, and it is more than enough to undo thanatos, the energy of death. Period. And I guess this is kind of the point of, after this realization, after we realize our calling, what we're meant to do, how we're meant to love, that's when we begin to give back. There is enough eros, enough life energy there now that we can give back to others. So what's interesting about the fifth stage is that after the wounding, after the realization of who they are, this is where they come back to home and begin to now help others on their path. I think of Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars series. Right, here is a man, a Jedi, who's a hero, who is home, and then his role begins to help teach and pass on his lessons to the young Luke Skywalker, right? As a mentor, as a teacher. He has this excess of life. He has this life energy to pass on. He has literally the Force, right? To help Luke discover in himself. And that's kind of like toward, I guess, the later stages of this hero's journey is this passing on, the helping others in their journey, the coming alongside people. Again, this doesn't always happen. There aren't always cases. But I think in life, it is beautiful when we have the opportunity to help someone in their difficulty. And you're going to run across this in your life where people will show up. You'll get into a conversation and you'll find out that someone's going through a hard time. And your response to that, how you can help them by just even listening and being there and being available, is huge. And that is kind of a later stage, I think in this case, because through the wounding, through the self-discovery, empathy, I think, is really built up in those moments, or can be built up in those moments. And having more empathy can help you help someone even more. Okay, now Richard's going to go on and talk a little bit about this life energy. He says, if it is authentic life energy, it is always experienced as a surplus or an abundance of life. The hero or heroine is by definition a generative person, to use Erik Erikson's fine term, concerned about the next generation and not just himself or herself. The hero lives in deep time and not just in his or her own small time. In fact, I wonder if you could be a hero or heroine if you do not live in what many call deep time, that is past, present, and future all at once, period. Okay, I circled that word deep time because I never heard it before, and it seems like a very complex word or phrase, deep time. And he says, so I have a question mark here. I'm not quite sure what he means when he says living in the past, present, and future all at once. Like, is that talk about like having like empathy for an understanding of the past, the present, and your future self? I'm not quite sure. I'm not even going to speculate here. What I do grab onto and what I did underline here is that when Richard talks about how he is the hero is concerned about the next generation and not just about him or herself. Again, this is this idea of just giving back. Giving back. There is, Richard's saying there's an authentic life energy. You have the ability, you have the resources within yourself to be able to give back to help someone else. And that's kind of the last stage of the hero's journey. Okay, so now we're just going to talk a little bit about the word hero and how we sometimes define it, at least here in America. He says, interestingly enough, this classic tradition of a true hero is not our present understanding at all. There is a little social matrix to our present use of the word. A hero now is largely about being bold, muscular, rich, famous, talented, or fantastic by himself. and often for himself, whereas the classic hero is one who goes the distance, whatever that takes, and has plenty left over for others. True heroism serves the common good or does not really heroism at all. To seek one's own American Idol fame, power, salary, or talent might historically have made one famous or even infamous, but not a hero. To be a celebrity or mere survivor today is often confused with heroism, probably a sign of our actual regression. He goes on and says, "We were meant to thrive and not just survive. We are glad when someone survives, and they surely took some courage and effort, but what are you going to do with your now resurrected life?" That is the heroic question, period. Okay, so I had to underline that line. What are you going to do with your now resurrected life? That's the question. That's the question that we need to be asking ourselves. Like, what do we do now? Like, the things we've gone through, the trials, the tribulations, the woundings in our journey, what do we do now with it? Are we going to, like me, maybe go through moments where we're bitter, angry, or will we eventually move out of that and then talk about and think about how do we help others in their journey? That's it's a difficult question, and depending on our mood, our psychology, how we're feeling, we're going to answer it differently. And I just want to say that if you're going through a very hard time and you have no desire to help other people, please do not feel at all like this is a guilt trip at all. Like it's just the question. Like, what are we going to do now? Like, how will we use the situation? It's not meant to be a guilt trip. It's just a question. What are we going to do with that? And for me, my answer is going to vary. And I hope, as I'm chatting about this now, I'm hoping that my answer is that, I hope I use, and in the future, that when I experience these painful moments, I hope I'm able to use these things to help others. I hope that that's where my heart is. But oftentimes we don't know. We don't know till we go through that period. And there may be a season where we need to be alone, where we need to be by ourselves, where we need to heal. We can't immediately go out and start to help people after a wounding. It takes time. It takes time for us to heal. Okay, Richard goes on and talks about leaving your comfort zone. He says, if you have spent many years building your particular tower of success and self-importance, your personal salvation project, as Thomas Merton called it, or have successfully constructed your own superior ethnic group, religion, or house, you won't want to leave it. Once you can get out of the house, your castle and comfort zone, much of the journey has a life and death of its own. The crucial thing is to get out and about and into the real and bigger issues. In fact, this was the basic plot line of the founding myth that created the three monotheistic religions, with Yahweh's words to Abraham and Sarah, "Leave your country, your family, and your father's house for the new land that I will show you." Period. It's that idea of getting out of our comfort zone, and that is one of the most difficult things, I think, for all of us. None of us wants to be uncomfortable. It's hard to leave comfort. It's hard to leave home. There can be a lot of stress and anxiety that goes along with that. And who wants that? It's not a pleasant thing to leave the familiar. And yet, so many of these classic journeys, so many of these stories of growth and renewal and coming to an understanding of what we're meant to do starts with the leaving of the comfortable. Richard goes on to talk about leaving your comfort zone by giving us the example of how Christ called his disciples. Richard says, most of the calls of the disciples in the New Testament are rather clearly invitations to leave your father and your nets, Matthew 4:22. When he calls his first disciples, Jesus is talking about further journeys to people who are already happily settled and religiously settled. He's not talking about joining a new security system or a religious denomination or even a religious order that pays all your bills. Again, it is very surprising to me that so many Christians who read the scriptures do not see this. Yet maybe they cannot answer a second call because they have not yet completed the first task. Unless you build your first house well, you will never leave it. To build your house well is ironically to be nudged beyond its doors. Period. And I think this is, again, Richard's talking about that container metaphor, about the first half of life is really developing kind of that structure of who you are. And you can't really, I guess, move into that second phase until you've kind of built that first structure. Again, a lot of metaphor, but I guess the idea is like until you kind of have that identity of who you think you are, you can't really move into who you really are. I think that's kind of a way to put it. But it is interesting how in the Gospels you have these stories where, when Jesus is first calling James and John and all the various disciples, Peter, he just walks up to them along the shoreline, right? And he just calls them, follow me. And in the Bible, you read it, all of a sudden they just follow Jesus. But you don't realize like all the stuff in between. Like these are people who had jobs, they had families, and they had obligations. And then all of a sudden they received this call, the true call of God, right? To follow me. And then they do. And you're like, the family must have been like, what? You did what today? You quit your job to go follow this Jesus person? Like, why would you do that? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. I can't even imagine what their families thought. But but this is kind of like this, and in the Bible, like you just kind of like skip over that. Like we have no idea about what happened there. All we know is like, oh, Jesus called the disciples and they follow him. We have no idea about what their families and friends thought about them just up and quitting their jobs and following Jesus. And in that case, it's like a true calling of God to follow Jesus. But in real life, like practically, it must have been the most bizarre thing for family and friends to be like, we're really concerned about Peter. He just up and left his job to follow this guy named Jesus, who we think is a prophet. We don't know much about him. It's kind of an interesting story right there. But it's interesting. Richard talks about how like, for us, he's like, unless you build that first house well, you have that structure in place, you'll never leave it. And he says to build your house well is to be nudged beyond its doors, where you finally feel comfortable enough to go exploring. I think that's the idea, to begin exploring, to begin your journey. Richard says, during my 14 years as a chaplain in the Albuquerque jail, I met so many men who remained stymied forever in a teenage psyche because they had not been able to build their first house well, or at all. Nor was there anyone who believed in them. They had usually not been parented well, or had not been given the mirroring that would have secured them within the first half of their own lives, period. And that's a very interesting and hard place. You think about, when I was reading this, I was thinking about all the people who have just suffered, who have lived very hard lives. They haven't had proper training, proper modeling. And because of that suffering, because of that early trauma, early difficulties, that might have led many people to do things that they wouldn't have had they been raised in a place that gave them structure, that gave them love, that gave them that, what Richard calls that divine mirroring. And I think like all of that helps us, I think, have more empathy for those who are suffering. and for making those types of choices. Richard says, yes, we are all seduced and fall into the second half of our lives, but part of that movement is precisely that we have finished the first task. At least in part, we can and will move forward as soon as we have completed and lived the previous stage. We almost naturally float forward by the quiet movement and grace when the time is right and the old agenda shows itself to be insufficient or even falls apart. All that each of us can do is to live in the now that is given. We cannot rush the process. We can only carry out each stage of our life to the best of our ability, and then we no longer need to do it anymore. But let's try to describe in greater detail how we build that first house, period. I think what I appreciate about this chapter is that Richard takes us through kind of these various stages of the hero's journey and how it can relate to us in real life, how it relates to a spiritual journey, how it relates to this awakening, this rebirth, this understanding of our true calling. And anyway, I do think this is a really kind of cool structure to kind of think about how life kind of operates for us. Okay, so in chapter 1, Richard gave us kind of an intro on the two halves of life and what they are. Chapter 2 here was all about kind of the structure of kind of our journey, our journey in life as kind of templated by the hero's journey. And now, in the next chapter, we're going to get into, in more detail, what the first half of life is. Covered it briefly here. Chapter 3, Richard gets into the meat of the first half of life. I'm excited to go through this again. Let's get to it in the next episode. Take care.